Hi, and welcome to this week's lecture where we are going to talk about implementing the IEP. And more specifically, we're going to talk about how you monitor those IEP goals and make sure that while you've written maybe you've written a beautifully written IEP with some great goals that are smart, you got to make sure you actually implement working on those goals and most importantly, monitor the progress. So how can we make some necessary steps, plan, procedures, etc., to make sure that we know how to measure the progress a student has made on those goals we've written. So my little cursor is not working. There we go. A little bit of the words might be cut off throughout this lecture, but if that's the case, just remember that this lecture is always available in the unit resources. So what is progress monitoring? It's always important to start off with just a general definition. And it really is the ongoing process. Really key is ongoing. So progress is ongoing. In collecting and analyzing data to determine student progress. So basically, we want to be able to make instructional and service decisions based on student performance. So we need to make sure that we're always looking at how a student's performing and then looking at how that performance goes back to where they were performing before we wrote the goal and while we've worked on those interventions, academic, behavioral, social, etc. So one of the most obvious rationales for this, first and foremost, I mean, it's the right thing to do. If you're writing an IEP and you're working on an IEP with a student, you want to make sure you actually implement it. That's the intent of it all, right? So let's just put that aside. Now there's another legal implication, and that is if you have a student who does receive special education services, meaning they have an IEP, then IDEA requires that you include a statement of how the student's progress toward the annual goals will be measured. So you need to make sure that you're always stating how you're going to consistently measure that growth. So there's current challenges that exist in our schools, and it's really important to highlight some of the pitfalls that educators often find themselves up against, unfortunately. The first one that we see in a lot of schools, and by the way, these are legal implications that end up going to due process, where you've got that disagreement between families and professionals where something's not working and the team's not getting along or the student's not getting their meaningful progress, etc. These are some of the legal reasons why you might be in that conflict situation. The first is the IEP team may fail to develop or implement progress monitoring plans. Believe it or not, it happens. I've seen a lot of IEPs written very poorly where they aren't measurable goals, and so by not having measurable goals, they also don't really have a plan on how they're going to monitor that progress. Also, unfortunately, responsibilities for progress monitoring are improperly delegated. So in these kinds of situations, basically, you've got a team of people, they meet, they write their goals, they have their meeting, and then all the educators walk away and they're like, not it. And so we don't really know who is implementing it. And believe it or not, that happens a lot. Or oftentimes, sometimes, unfortunately, teachers will put it all on the paraprofessional, and that's not really their key responsibility at all. They are to support the teacher, not be the teacher. The third challenge we see in our schools is the IEP team does not plan or implement progress monitoring for behavior intervention plans. So behavior intervention plans are embedded in this progress monitoring component too. Although behavior plans aren't a component of this class, it is a component of that might need to be addressed in a student's IEP. So if a student has behavior challenges and they have a behavior intervention plan, just like we've seen with goals being written that are beautifully written or not, we also see behavior plans that are written and there's no follow through with data collection. So we don't know if the behavior is actually changing or not. The fifth one is team uses inappropriate measures to determine student progress toward graduation. So not looking at the right things we need to be looking at to know whether or not a student's making progress toward graduation and whatever that might be for that student. And the last is progress monitoring is not frequent enough to meet the requirements of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act. So that was the most recent reauthorization, or to provide meaningful data to IEP teams. So let's talk about some of the prerequisites that you need to have before I talk about the 5-step process that I'm going to teach you on progress monitoring. One of the first most important prereq is that you have collected data that provides evidence of student progress. So you need to know where the student is before you can identify where they need to go, right? So we need to know if we're working on math facts, for example, or math skills, First, we need to have a baseline, a good understanding of what the student's present levels of performance are. And so we want to know where they're at, and then using that information, we develop our SMART goals. And we know that these goals need to be measurable, observable, defined clearly. That includes the condition under which the behavior is performed, as well as a performance criterion. This is where we want to have all the who will do what, how well, under what conditions, lots of details. We also know these as SMART goals. So the S is specific. We want to state exactly what we want the student to accomplish. M, measurable. We need to know how we're going to demonstrate and evaluate the extent to which this goal has been met. It needs to be achievable. So we want to have stretch and challenging goals, but we needed to have it within the ability to achieve that outcome. So there needs to be an action-oriented verb. We need to know what that student will be doing. It needs to be relevant. How does that goal tie into their key responsibilities, the students, what they're working on? How is it aligned to objectives? How is it aligned to state standards? All these important areas a student needs to learn about. And then time bound. We need to have a set of one or more target dates by which the goal should be successfully and timely completed. So this is something that gives us benchmarks basically for when we know something should be met. All of these components are essential for a good goal. Believe it or not, I have seen more bad goals than good goals, unfortunately. And throughout teacher licensure program, throughout your work, hopefully we will be continuously giving you opportunities to write goals, to write SMART goals. You may feel like you're doing them to like the nth, and if you look at one more SMART goal, you're going to throw up. But if you're going to be a special education teacher or even a general education teacher, you're going to be working with students who have IEPs, and you need to know what a SMART goal is. So if you don't like SMART goals and you have a hard time with it, you might not be in the right field. But believe it or not, SMART goals make our job as educators really helpful because we have a very clearly defined task of which we're going to work with on how to help that student achieve what they need, academically, behaviorally, or socially, or emotionally. So as part of that first step of data collection, we want to first and foremost review that existing IEP. So before you start, these are the 5 steps for effective progress monitoring that I'm going to be reviewing. So step 1 is we need to first start and make sure that our IEP contains SMART goals, as well as a clear and specific statement of the student progress. So where has the student been and where are they going? So if there are not SMART goals, if we're over here in the no column, what we need to do is determine and define missing objectives of the goal, missing pieces or objectives of the goal. We need to determine and define missing pieces of the student's progress. If it is SMART, then first we get to celebrate, yay! Then we get to look at how we're going to measure the behaviors under the conditions using the criteria set forth in the goal that is defined in our IEP. Remember, it's SMART, which means we should already have some measurable information in there. And then what we're going to do is follow with the type of data we're going to get, a schedule, and people who are going to be responsible for putting that in the IEP and for making sure we implement it and collect that data. So we're on step 1 still. When we determine if the IEP goals are measurable, we want to look at several factors. Now, I'm not going to read all of these out loud. You have them listed in front of you, so I recommend you kind of just go through them, look at them. And really, some of the key things I want to point out are the questions I have in the parentheses. So what do we need to observe of this student? What type of data are we going to collect? Who's going to collect it? Where will we collect it? So it's almost all the who, what, when, where, why. That's the part of really determining what we're going to be doing for the first step. So this is part of kind of like your blueprint. You're designing your IEP measurement house. You have to draw what the house is going to look like before you can start to put all that furniture in there, right? So this is what we're doing. We're just kind of drawing our framework. That was kind of a weird analogy, but whatever. Just go with me. I try to keep these fun. Hopefully you're laughing or not. But you want to make sure you have kind of an outline of what you need to look at before you can go to the next steps. The next step is actual data collection. So this is why it's important that you set out the who, what, when, where, why, because you can't collect the data if you don't know who's going to do it, when you're going to do it, where, etc. So as far as that goes, we need to basically select our measurement tools. So what tools are we going to use to measure progress towards student performance? And I'm going to go over a few of these data collection types of tools that you might use. But remember that there's a lot of different types of measurement, and they're all okay. And they all provide a clear picture of the student's progress as long as you do them the correct way and you make sure you collect data to in its fullness. You can't just watch a kid one day and be like, oh, goal met. There's got to be a lot of different criteria, right? So we want to look at some of those. So here's some examples. There's kind of a lot of language here, but first and foremost, there's direct measurement, and that's the most valid and reliable indicator of student progress because you're watching it in action. So you're actually seeing them perform that behavior. So it might be observing the student firsthand, where you might be taking notes during your observation. You might also have a data chart that marks down the number of times a student maybe completes a certain activity or answers a question. Duration might be how long they're able to do it. So if you're looking at how long they can read quietly or silently, or how long they can read out loud, or something to that effect. Interval recording is what they can perform at a certain amount of interval. Time sampling is basically at the end of a certain time. So maybe every 5 minutes you're going to observe the student and see how they're doing. Now, interval and time sampling is more of your behavioral data, whereas frequency and duration and some of the qualitative parts, observation narratives, is more for your academics. Other forms of direct measurement might be criterion reference tests. These are common assessments that we see in our schools. Oftentimes teachers create them, or a department might create it, or it might come as part of a curriculum set. Usually it focuses on skills that have been achieved in the general education curriculum. Meanwhile, curriculum-based measures are brief standardized samples. So these ones are actually standardized, while a criterion is more like, are you reaching a criterion of a certain skill? Curriculum is based on standardized samples and looking at fluency, accuracy, and time of completing certain activities. So those are more of your time tests that you might see, large schools, etc., large classroom assessments, etc. Indirect measurements are different in that they're not as valid and reliable, but they're also quality as well. They can be very helpful. One is might include rubrics. And you're going to learn a lot about that this week, and that's when we're looking at performance on a scale of basically what we want to be advanced all the way down to poor, not proficient. You might have qualitative and quantitative connotations in there, or things you might write down in there. Interviews, you might interview students, you might interview teachers, you might interview family members. There's a lot of different people you could interview. And then there's student self-monitoring as well, where you might actually have the student document their own behaviors and performance through self-recording or any kind of specific cues you might give them. And there's some examples of different student self-monitoring and student data collection in our unit this week. There's so much data in this world. There's never a shortage. There's never a shortage of examples of good data, but there is a shortage of good data, believe it or not. So authentic measurement might be something that really is definitely more performance-based on students. It might be work samples. So you might have actual samples of their writing or projects, etc. And also a lot of classrooms will do portfolio. So, you know, I have 3 daughters, and I've watched them all go through their different programs in education, and in middle school they all have their own portfolio of, usually it's in the English class, it's 6th grade they do it, and they'll keep their own portfolio of all their writing from the very beginning of 6th grade all the way to the very end. And the end of the school year we have a parent-child basically conference instead of a parent teacher. It's me with my child, and they're showing me all of their work, and it's very powerful because students are able to demonstrate their work right off the bat, but also they're able to see their own growth, and they're able to verbalize it to you, and it's a pretty neat thing to see happen. Next step is our schedule of data. So remember, first we wanted to identify what is the data we need to collect. And second is, how are we going to collect it? And now we're looking at, when are we going to collect it? So the schedule depends on how the service is delivered. So it might be how often a student receives special education services, or how often they work in math, or the amount of time they work in reading, or whatever their goals are based on. If you have something where you're doing like direct instruction in the classroom, then you might have time where you can immediately work data collection into your daily and weekly plans for instruction. So when I was a teacher, I used to walk around with a little post-it note, and I would write notes on my students' performance all throughout the days. I would just constantly take data, and I'd write the date, and I'd write what they're working on, and I'd write what, if they missed anything, how they did, in all different areas: academics, behavior, social, etc. And then I had a folder for each child, and I would just literally have blank pages, and I would just stick the post-it notes there. And then at the end of the day, I'd kind of write them up and summarize how that data was. A real quick and easy way. The most important thing is that was just one informal way that I took data, by the way. So it doesn't have to be separate from instructional time. This happened while I was working with the students. So I was able to really make some progress with not only data collection, but working directly with the student. And I didn't have to pull them aside and sit down and work with them in kind of an artificial situation of a testing, situation. It just worked its way in, which was nice. So as far as that schedule goes, you can also have indirect instruction or support. So you might, like I said, work that in while you're teaching them. You might also have other people take data. So you might ask like paraprofessionals or general education teachers or other service providers. You might also have some of that consultation help as well. Most important thing is that you have a plan. So the data collection schedule, basically, this is just a little table to give you an idea, based on this book called Administrator's Guide to Measuring Achievement for Students with IEPs. But basically, you want to determine the most efficient way to progress monitor frequently, so it gives you the data without driving you crazy and making sure you get accurate data. So if progress is monitored daily, then the effectiveness may be determined within 2 weeks. If it's twice a week, it can be determined within a month, weekly, determined within a quarter, quarterly, not to be determined even after a year. So basically, you want to be able to make sure that you're taking data often enough that you're able to determine the effectiveness of that data collection schedule and that student progress, so you can really see the change. Fourth step is data compilation. So once you've collected all that data, you need to compile it. You need to compile it because, first of all, you don't want to wait until the very end. And we all know what happens when we wait until the very end to do an assignment. It can be a mess on a really late night, and we often make really small, easily overlooked mistakes. And small, easily overlooked mistakes aren't very good when you're looking at student progress and performance, and you only do it once a year as a team, or as needed. So what I mean by that is, do your data collection often and take the time to compile your data so that when you're at the year-long annual review, you're not having this massive amount of data that you've got to go through that you can't make any sense of. So you can use that information in your team. It also helps with team meetings, etc. So if your data is collected daily, then you should be compiling your data weekly. If it's 2 to 3 times per week, then you want to be compiling it bi-monthly or weekly or bi-weekly. And then if you're collecting data once a week, then you could compile that monthly. So this is just a little kind of guide framework of a suggestion of some compilation schedule for you when you're going to compile your data. Step 5 is your data reporting, because you've taken all this data, now it's time to report it, right? So remember, progress on IEP goals and short-term objectives, if you have those, is reported to parents as often as typical students receive academic progress reports, and it can be more, but it's mandated to be as often. So it's not just once a year. When typically developing students have their mid-progress reports, their yearly progress reports, their monthly, that's when you want to be providing families information about their students who have services on an IEP. So some format might be compilation forms, or you might compile it all in a form. You might have graphs. You might write a narrative that includes a hard data where you might actually have graphs or data numbers or percentages or tables. And you want to make sure you explain any instructional changes or specific circumstances. If a goal is not being met, why isn't it? Show how often you're working on it, etc. So, just to kind of summarize everything we've talked about, One of the most important things I want to talk about with student progress is that each goal or short-term objective has four really important aspects that we must consider to be good professionals. The first is we want to always consider student progress. So when a student has an IEP, that is because they have a disability that impacts their learning to such that they require specialized instruction designed to meet their unique needs. And that means that specialized instruction needs to be monitored to make sure that they're not falling even farther behind if they are farther behind, or we're making sure that they're getting the education that they need, and we're making sure the IEP is relevant, etc. So we've got to start with progress. Is the student making progress? Looking at that criteria. The next is we want to compare to peers or standards. Basically, that doesn't mean, if a student has a disability, we're not going to say they're not developed, they're not the same as their their partner. They're not nearly as good as Jimmy is. It's not like that at all. It's really a matter of saying, what grade level are they performing at compared to their typically developing peers, and or how are they performing on the typical standards that we see, the third grade standards, etc. How are they performing in those standards so we can make sure we're always working toward that progress that we want our students to have. Independence is another really important factor, and that is the student more independent in the goal area? Are they able to achieve this? We have to be careful that when we're saying a student has met a goal, that they've actually met it in a truly naturalistic setting, that we're not prompting them, we're not feeding them information, and it's generalizable in a lot of different ways. Otherwise, they really aren't truly meeting that goal. We might be checking something off our list, but we're really not checking it off their list. So we want to make sure that student can independently work toward that goal as well, if that's an area that's needed. And then goal status. We want to look at the goal status of, will work in this goal area be continued? Does the student still have areas of need in this math area or behavioral area, or are we kind of done in that area? Has that student really mastered a lot of content and they're ready to move on to next topic areas? Finally, progress monitoring processes are focused, clearly defined, and completed. We know that ensures a meaningful educational program for students with disabilities. So as you go through this unit and you look through all the there's so much information about progress monitoring. And I did my best to provide you with a lot of helpful websites, videos, resources, etc. But most importantly, just remember this: we're working to help a student succeed in areas that they need to work on, just like we would with any other student. And so when we have that IEP, that is their curriculum. That is what we want to work toward. And that curriculum should be based, their IEP should be based on their grade level standards and other information that's relevant. But we want to make sure that we're not just writing an IEP, but we're actually implementing it and we're monitoring it. And that's where data collection comes in handy. And that's what we mean by progress monitoring toward that IEP goal. Once we meet that goal, we've met a major accomplishment and we get to move on to other things. And if you're like me, anytime we meet a goal and we strive for something and we achieve some or most of it, we know that good things happen. So that's what we want. We want good things to happen for students and their families. So I hope this was helpful. I encourage you to go back through just the plain PowerPoint if my face cut off any of it, and always reach out if you have any questions or concerns. Looking forward to talking to you in the discussion board this week. Have a good one. Bye.